Thank you for joining this ADL Initiative technical webinar today. At the ADL Initiative, we understand that collaboration is an important aspect of our community. So every now and then we organize webinars to share information on important learning subjects. Today's focus is the Enterprise Course Catalog, featuring ADL Initiative team members and CETA contractors Brent Smith and Ashley Howell, and Enterprise Course Catalog subject matter experts and developers Matt Dreyer from edX and Eric Flamer from Deloitte. The speakers will share their vision and progress on the ECC, which will enable a global search capability that pulls information from decentralized local catalogs across the DoD and aggregates the content into a single defense-wide portal. There will be time at the end of the hour for the speakers to address questions, so if you have any, please type them into the chat for the panel to review throughout the webinar. Please note that the chat is open and visible to all attendees. If you know anyone else who would like to be added to our distribution list for these webinars, please feel free to have them reach out to us and we can add them to the list. This webinar will be recorded and made available on adlnet.gov. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ashley Howell. I'll flip it over to you, Ashley.
Hi, thank you, Liz. I am going to, perfect, have Brent start off with sharing the slides. I'm going to go ahead and kick off today's session by providing an overview of the Enterprise Course Catalog effort. Then I'm going to hand it over to Brent where he's going to discuss the related standards. And then Brent, if you want to go to the next slide for me. I will then pass it on to Eric and Matt, who will discuss the current development as it relates to the Enterprise Course Catalog prototype that they're working towards building out, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. Right, so before we talk about all these fun things, I quickly want to take a step back and look at the current context. Right now, we have a lot of training and education opportunities that exist right now, but because we have disconnected systems, information about these opportunities resides in silos, so it's very difficult to share information about these opportunities or sharing these metadata. As a result, it takes a lot of time to find which systems you need to access to find the right piece of the right training content at that right time. And if we go on to the next one, it's also hard to know what already exists. So when we're thinking about developing courses, it's often hard to create and leverage existing courses that already existed within DoD. And then finally, it's hard to know what supplemental information exists out there. There's a lot of great supplemental information like professional development opportunities, but without an overview or knowledge of what's out there, those opportunities often get missed. So as a result, ADL has been doing research on the Enterprise Course Catalog capability to solve these challenges. The ECC is comprised of the tools, the technologies, and the standards for achieving this interoperability and being able to aggregate all of these information or metadata about these training and education opportunities in one place. As part of this research, we did kind of a pre-alpha prototype development where we looked at how we're going to start to integrate these pieces together and how we can leverage these metadata to improve discoverability. So I'm going to quickly share my screen and walk through what this common portal might look like and how we can leverage these metadata. All right, everyone should have access to my screen now. What you're looking at is the landing page. Before we dive into this, I just want to clarify that the Enterprise Course Catalog, it's not a new physical catalog of all these listings. Again, it's referring to the processes for integrating all of these courses together. So again, the tools, the technologies, and the standards that make this integration possible. So what we're looking at now is all of the metadata that we took from some representative courses in the DoD and started to, again, optimize how we're able to discover these opportunities. So in the future, we might be able to pull in things like ratings or categories and start to highlight popular courses or new courses, things like that. If we go into the advanced search, what you can see on the side here are certain metadata fields or pieces of information that can really drive on the discovery of particular course opportunities of relevance to various users. So we have things like your specific role, location, formatting, and availability. But of course, we expect these to grow as we start to firm up development and of course the related standard, which Brent will discuss in more detail. So I'm just going to quickly search for acquisition so I can show you how we're thinking about displaying these courses and how these can potentially evolve as we start to mature the other related aspects of the ECC. Clicking on one of the courses we have here, we can see how these metadata are expected to evolve and grow over time. It's also something I want to highlight. We do expect to incorporate different role-based permissions. So if we look at this from the perspective of a course manager, they might be able to see course-specific information like their evaluation reports or ratings, things like that, really starting to get all of the pieces that exist not only in the standard course catalog, but maybe in their registrar system or survey systems, things like that, getting everything in one place again to improve that discoverability and accessibility of all of these learning opportunities. I'm going to stop sharing, and Brent, I'm going to have you open up the slides and I'll quickly introduce our high-level approach for how we are going to achieve this vision. Okay, starting at the bottom, we have information about courses is aggregated from, again, not just course catalog systems, but things like the registrar and the survey systems from different organizations into a common place or a common database. We call this the experience index, which is informally kind of like a giant bucket of metadata. This is made possible by what we call these experience index agents. They provide the scraping of all the course catalog information. This is done automatically. And it also allows the organization to choose what they want to share. And so I wanted to emphasize here that we want to minimize any impact on the organizations. So again, they'll have the opportunity to choose what they want to share across DoD. Then by linking these course catalog pieces of information to common definitions and competencies and credentials, we can start to get a better understanding of the context of these opportunities. So taking all information from all the organizations, this all gets federated up into a global experience index or like a giant bucket of metadata. This is all made visible through the Enterprise Course Catalog portal, which I just briefly walked you through. So that was a really quick high-level run-through of why we're doing what we're doing, our current research, and a little bit into how in the next steps. I'm going to hand it over to Brent and he'll discuss the supporting standard. Thank you.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you, Ashley. So Ashley talked about the prototype effort that we did. Over the past few years, we've been working with a lot of our different stakeholders across the department to understand more about how their specific catalogs are implemented. And typically, each catalog is driven by their own database system with their own data schema, their own data model, if you will. This slide here is just an example of some of the differences. So they have the same basic field, but they call them different things. And then, so the state of the current state of course catalog across DoD is very fragmented. You don't have any kind of standardized data model for how these catalogs work. And you don't have common terms for how things are structured or how the database that drives those catalogs are structured. So we kind of started just through our prototype effort of kind of aggregating all of these and then started doing a scrape of all the various standards that are out there. We looked at schema.org. We certainly looked a lot at the learning object metadata model, LOM, which was part of SCORM. And we looked at other things like credential engines, learning profiles, learning opportunity profile, some of those other aspects there. What we ended up coming up with was a common data model. And there's actually a plug here. We've got the IEEE's Learning Technology Standards Committee has a study group that's ongoing and taking this model and kind of running with it right now. And so the P2881 study group, if anyone's interested, if anyone wants to take a look at the model, we're happy to go into the weeds with that. But at a high level, what we did is we took a lot of the fields that are part of LOM, and we started updating and modernizing them. So little things like under general information, we include what's your LRS endpoint? If you're going to use XAPI, where are you storing that for this particular activity? Under technical information, for example, we added requirements for different types of sensors or biometrics and data that might sit outside of the XAPI standard. Video for after-action review systems that you might have as part of a simulation system. One of the biggest changes that we made was we took the category that was previously called educational information, and we broke that down into learning content, learning activities, and courses. The whole idea there is to look at what's the granularity that we have in reporting. LOM looked at a course as pretty much one entity, and it had one little type of aggregation that you could kind of start to denote inside of that standard. We took a different approach. We took content, a video, might be deployed across multiple learning activities. It might be used in a mobile application, it might be used in an online course, or it might be used in a classroom. And by understanding how it's used, we can start to prioritize the life cycle needs of that content. What content's being used the most, what is most effective and whatnot. So we really kind of honed in on the cognitive alignment for each of those. One of the big takeaways for course is we added a field called course section. I think that's the low-hanging fruit for really increasing the granularity for how we can describe our different courses, and more importantly, how we can start reporting out from these courses to improve the granularity of learner performance data that we're able to track. Two quick other things. The alignment section is also been built up, and that's really the alignment to the different educational frameworks that you want to align your content to. We, of course, do a lot of work with competencies and competency-based learning, but it could be as simple as enabling and terminal learning objectives. There's a lot of different educational frameworks out there. So when we build a standard, we don't just build it in a vacuum. We really try to embrace the community. That's why we work through IEEE and whatnot. And so we try to build it in a way that is extensible. We certainly have ideas for how it should be implemented across DoD, but we realize that to really make these things successful, we have to be interoperable with organizations outside of DoD. The last thing is something relatively new, and that's the relationship, and that comes from working with some of the folks in the Air Force. And they had a need to tie some of their courses to their Air Force specialty codes. Well, all the services have occupational specialty codes of some sort. And so we wanted to be able to tie to those, also platforms that you're training for. So there's a whole bunch of different things that we can start to do with the relationship there too. So a lot of this stuff is in review, and it's currently being developed. It's not even part of the IEEE yet. It's just been proposed, and we're kind of working through to polish it up and submit that as a draft standard. The group is currently looking at it, but we have high hopes for the way this is going to move forward. Definitely sign up. And I really don't need to talk about this because Ashley did, but the big thing here is that all of the data, we want to automate the collection and take humans out of the loop. Some of this will be created during development. Other aspects will be created using the usage data, the paradata. So it's going to be derived metadata that will be updated continuously. And so that would be an automated process. But we do want to give control of that metadata and the ability to share these courses and content and activities to the local organizations. So with that, I think that's the end of my section. And I'm going to pass it over to Eric and Matt.
Hey, thanks so much, Brent and Ashley. So my name is Eric Flamer. I'm with Deloitte Consulting, and I'm the project manager for the enterprise course catalog prototype that we're developing. We can jump to the next slide to give you just an overview of what we've embarked on. So we started on this effort together with edX about mid-September, just a few short months ago. And our ultimate prerogative is to work through building out the technology that we've already started speaking about as part of this presentation. So you saw that front-end portal. We'll be using that that user experience approach that ADL has been researching and approaching in their pre-alpha prototype, and working to build that out into ultimately an interim operating capability for the ECC. Along the way, we're going to be building out the metadata service that Brent has just described, and the automation agents that we're going to be going over and demoing in just a few moments that are going to really do the legwork to transform existing course catalog data and bring it into an indexing service that we're going to be using to allow for the search and the user experience that we've mentioned already. Another element that we're working on is obviously starting the cybersecurity accreditation process. So as we design this this capability, we're working with ADL and our C5ISR cybersecurity stakeholders to make sure that we're planning ahead for the full operating capability into the future. And the way that we go about building out this prototype is through agile software development. So we have essentially working builds every 2 months so that we're making pretty significant and incremental progress throughout this period of performance leading up to us being done with this prototype phase in September 2021. I will just mention that what is always great in working with ADL on these efforts is the integrated product team members that we have that help provide that DoD and service level perspective as sort of joint product owners to help us build this capability out. And I want to call attention to some that may not be on the line today, but the organizations that are supporting this effort. I did see a question earlier in the chat. We've got the Defense Acquisition University. We've got Joint Knowledge Online. We have the Air Force Air Education Training Command. And then we also have the Defense Civilian Personnel Advisory Service. So we have 4 IPT members that meet with us on an ongoing basis throughout this prototype period of performance and help us understand obviously the organizational context for building out the capability, but also the personas and the use cases, which we're going to review in just a few moments. So the final thing I'll say here right now before turning it over to Matt to take us through the ECC prototype solution and our iterative phase that we have right now is just mentioning that as you'll see by the end of this presentation, by the end of the fiscal year, the government fiscal year, we'll have some opportunities for involvement moving forward. Ultimately, I think we can all agree, as Brent mentioned, that this will have a larger impact, not just within the organizational setting, but also in an academic setting and the sort of broader lifelong learning continuum that we're all taking part in our professional lives. So thank you so much for all your dedication and what you do already. And we're hoping that you get excited by what we showcase and the opportunities that you'll have to join in the future. So Matt, with that, you want to take the next slides?
Yes, absolutely. Great. Thanks, Eric. I think one of the words that Eric actually mentioned really strikes home with me, which is exciting. This technology is a very exciting technology, and it may not seem that way at first when we're talking about aggregating metadata and transforming it and things along those lines. But there's really a lot of enabling technology that's coming out of this, and I think that's the real key to focus on here. So hi, I'm Matt Dreyer. I am from edX. We are an online learning platform, and we are also a major player in the educational technology space. We're a not-for-profit. We actually develop an open source solution that we have people from all over the world interacting with and deploying. So it's very, very, very exciting for us to see this technology being developed, and we're actually excited ourselves to be involved with the development of this technology. Discovery of learning opportunities is a major problem that impacts everyone who has a need to transform in some way. So as part of our not-for-profit mission to enable everyone to have access to quality education all over the world, whether or not it comes from us or not, we want to be part of that, and this is a great way for us to get involved. So I'm functioning as the product owner on this particular project, and that means that I care a lot about the people. I care a lot about who's benefiting from this technology, and I care a lot about who is ultimately using the technology. And so what I really want to talk about on this slide is who's benefiting from the technology a little bit more. So, one of the things to think about is that this is not just one piece of technology that's going to live in one network. This is being designed as an open source solution, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But essentially, it's being designed to be deployed to multiple cloud environments and in multi-instance sort of configurations. And what that basically means is there are different components of this. If we go back to that architecture diagram, actually, we'll see it in a little bit again. There are different pieces of this, and they're going to be able to be deployed to different places depending on the need. So these agents may live in a domain that's not even close to the index service that they are shipping their metadata to, for example. There can be multiple components that all depend on a particular agent or a particular index service and things like that. So it's a very, very flexible and very, I'd say, broadly applicable piece of technology. The other thing about it is that these agents are able to, they're going to be constructed in such a way that they're designed to work with very specific source repositories. So we don't have to have one agent that is this all-purpose cable and we've got to tweak it in different ways in order to get it to work right with different things. Whenever there's a source repository that needs to be pulled into this aggregation solution, well, we'll simply construct an agent, whether that's constructed by the core team or someone in the DoD or perhaps someone out in the open source community. An agent will be constructed that maps to that repository, and then that metadata will be available for aggregation and discovery. So it's actually a very simple pattern in that regard. And that's what we've really focused on in terms of the design. We've focused on patterns and ensuring that we're putting the right patterns in place with this software so that we're not building something that's obsolete as soon as it's delivered. We want to be flexible, extensible, and scalable. Talking a little bit beyond the idea of an agent that can connect to a repository, we have the idea of the index service. And one thing that's being built in here, again, with this idea of repeatable, scalable patterns, is that index services will actually be able to syndicate to other index services, again, with the proper controls in place for shipping metadata and pieces of metadata from one to the other. But we'll be able to essentially have a constellation of index services at the end of the day, where you could potentially ship metadata from one to the other and present them in different discovery experiences for different use cases. So again, we don't have one instance of this deployed in one place within DoD necessarily. In fact, every organization, every interested organizational L&D technology team could potentially deploy their own ECC installation. And then you can aggregate your own information locally, and then you can syndicate it out from your index service to someone else, all while hosting your own discovery service to on yourself. So that's really some of the value that's coming along here. You can actually deploy the software yourself if you like, or simply aggregate up to another index service and let someone else handle the discovery and have inbound come to you. If you're an experienced provider, and you might be in the audience right now and you're listening to this going, how do I get my content into this? Well, again, it kind of comes back to this idea of these agents. An experienced provider could construct an agent that makes their particular content available. These experienced providers are internal at DoD. You're delivering training or some sort of learning experience in some way. Brent mentioned simulators and things earlier. There's all kinds of great training going on at DoD, some very advanced things. Discoverability is, as Ashley hinted at earlier, is one of the major problems. How do we engage and get these experiences to be able to be discovered by people? So again, we construct an agent, we connect it to the repository for that particular content or that experience type, and then that becomes discoverable essentially through the aggregation pipeline. This also works for external providers. So, think of someone like edX, for example. We have thousands of courses online, right? Anybody can come to edX and learn for free, and et cetera. You've heard it before. We actually offer an API, like many online content providers out there. We have lots of friends in the space who are also doing great work to educate the world, and they all have APIs. We all have them. And so agents can be constructed to bring in external learning opportunities and make those discoverable as well. So you can bring the best information from your content partners, whether they're internal or external, all together into one discoverable interface. Very exciting. If you're a third-party learning technology provider, perhaps you sell a particular type of service or you have some technology that is an experience delivery technology or something along those lines, you can hook into this as well. This is an open source solution. You can see we actually have the open source community called out as well specifically. But essentially you can augment this solution in ways that help to incorporate your own learning technology solutions. So, for example, you can add additional components and have an XIS potentially syndicate out. You can create agents that tap into your own network of content and experience providers and make those and provide those as your own package, for example, that could then be deployed to an instance of an ECC. It's all different ways that you can use this technology as a third-party technology provider. And then lastly, like I mentioned, this is going to be published as open source technology. We actually already have a repository set up at GitHub, and we're beginning to push just some very early stage code up there from the Deloitte engineering team. But eventually this will become a very robust online project. We're very hopeful about that. And so you can go to github.com and search for OpenLXP. And LXP is a learning experience platform. It's designed to facilitate discovery, access, and reporting of learning experiences. And so we've named this OpenLXP, and you can go and you can see the various components that are up there. Again, not much there right now, but by the end of this project, there'll be a robust implementation for each component that's outlined in the diagrams. All right, if we can move on to the next slide, please. All right, so again, I'm the product person. I like to talk about the excitement of the technology and who's benefiting from it. So we've talked about sort of the interested parties that may gain value from the technology. Now let's talk just a little bit about who's using the technology. So when we deploy an instance of the ECC, we've really zeroed in on 4 primary personas here. We also have a 5th one, the system operator, who's really responsible for sort of the care and feeding of the system. And we've got a lot of use cases where we're actually considering the operators, which in my experience is someone who sort of doesn't always get some of the spotlight when it comes to use case development. But our 4 main users of the system really are 2 on the management side and 2 on the delivery or fulfillment side, if you want to think of it that way. On the management side, we have the ultimate owner of each experience. And this is usually one person, maybe a few people at a particular source, a particular experience delivery provider. And these are the people who are responsible for ensuring that the experiences are actually online, available, valuable, responsible for programming, things along those lines. And then we've identified that there's a manager type of persona where these are the people who would be interacting with the system a little bit more often. They may be the ones today who are publishing things on the systems, the source systems. They may need to log into the ECC through our management interface and perhaps augment some of the information that's being pulled from the source system. They may need to correct some things. So there's going to be a management interface that we deliver along with the discovery interface that facilitates augmentation and supplementation and even correction of metadata records where necessary. So that's sort of the management side of things. And then on the consumption side of things, we have 2. We've identified that there's a facilitator, and this is sort of the instructor, supervisor, persona where someone is actually helping someone else work their way through a learning experience. And there are a lot of use cases that actually bubbled up when we did our initial analysis work around this to try to identify exactly, who are these people and what role do they play in terms of experience. And then lastly, we have what we feel is probably the primary user of the discovery side of this, which is really what all of this is about at the end of the day. And that is our experienced consumer, or more casually, we refer to this person as the learner, right? So the experienced consumer is the person who's looking for training, looking to transform in some way, and they are attempting to find what they're looking for through this technology. And hopefully we get a fast match for them and really try to nail it. And that's sort of the idea here. As you saw with Ashley's demonstration of the pre-alpha prototype user experience, not a lot of bells and whistles, right? What we're really trying to do here is we're trying to provide a simple and efficient user experience. Really, again, facilitate identification of those learning opportunities and direct people to them quickly. I've been referring to this as a grand central station where anybody can come in and get to where they need to be very quickly. We really want to try to get people to that learning and minimize the time cost and minimize the the confusion factor that people run into when they use a lot of systems. So next slide. Okay, so what are we going to look at? Okay, that's enough talking about the people. Now you guys want to see the fun technology. So let's jump into our demo. And before we transition over to Karen, who's going to get the agent technology going for us, just want to talk a little bit about what we're actually looking at here. So back to our architecture slide, you can see we have all of our pieces on here. We have our source repositories and the cans. We have our agents who are watching the repositories and they're reacting to changes they see, whether those are a pull model or a push model. Again, source dependent, so each of these agents will have their own implementations. And then there's the experience index itself. So these agents are scooping up metadata in some way. They're going to validate that metadata to ensure that it fits their understanding of what it's supposed to look like from the source. and they're going to run through a transformation, and they're going to convert that metadata into the common standard that Brent presented, P2881. And then it's going to run another validation just to confirm that after the transformation is done, I got what I expected. And if you review the P2881 standard, you'll see there are required fields in order to be verified as compliant with the standard. And then there are recommended fields and there are optional fields. And so what we're really doing when we do a validation step post-transformation is we're ensuring that we've met the requirements for compliance, and then noting any recommendations or optionals that are missing. So along those lines. And then there's obviously the linked data database that Brent referred to as well. This is a schema service where these mappings live. This linked data database is where we are actually hosting the reference schemas for our source repositories, hosting the reference schema for the P2881 standard, and hosting the mapping for transforming from the source to the target, essentially. So all of that context is really held within the mappings, and it enables the agents to their implementations to focus primarily on getting into a source, pulling out the records, and then doing the work. So, all right. So if we're ready to hand it over to Karen, we can share her screen, and then we can see some technology in action.
Hey everyone, I'm Karen, a developer from the Deloitte teams working in the ECC project. So we have implemented the extraction, transformation, and loading steps using the DAU data, the Defense Acquisition University data. Here we have the raw modified metadata from the DAU, which contains the records with details on different courses provided. So our aim with the ETL process is to transform this data using the P2881 reference schema, which we can see here. So in the next step, we basically have to extract the data from the source, which would be in the experience source repository, where the primary data resources supporting the entire ECC solutions are located. So we have our schemas, and we do the transformation using this. This is the step that Matt did explain, the validation, where we check for required and optional fields. So now we can run the code.
And so here what you're seeing is the agent waking up, it's pulling in the source data, it's comparing it to the schema files the reference files that it has, it's doing the transformation, and then it's ultimately noting where there were any discrepancies. All of this information is being output to the console, but it'll also be available in log file format for monitoring purposes. And then it will also be surfaced in the management console for experienced managers who might need to go in and review any issues that may have come up during during the ETL pipeline cycle.
Exactly, yeah. And so we have also gone through the transformation step when we ran the code, and using the P2881 mapping and transforming, we do get the transform data, which is now in the form for the P2888 form.
Great, thanks, Karen.
Yep, thank you. Thanks,
Sure,
everyone.
sure. All right, so that's just a little sort of glimmer of where things are at with respect to technology. The team's really starting to pick up speed now after the holiday break. We've got the agent technology working along, and we're starting to move into the index service technology itself. We also have team members working on the Elasticsearch component as well as the schema service component, the linked data database, essentially. And so once all of these ETL pipeline components come together, then we're really in the process, or really in the position of just developing more and more agents to plug into the pipeline. And so like I mentioned earlier, it's really about establishing a pattern with a scalable, repeatable sort of approach. And if we can get to the point where it's simply need another repository, create an agent, publish it to the open source project, and then there it is. Whether it's internal or external, doesn't really matter in terms of the data repository itself. We're just talking about implementations of agents. There's obviously going to be reusable technology across agents, and so things will be available to be reused. And I think that'll be part of the power of this, and really help to accelerate agent construction. But I envision a day where there's 5,000 agents that the ECC supports, and you really just pick and choose which ones you want for your installation of the ECC. Or if you're just a single experience provider, you may just have your agent that you keep track of and your list of index services that you are shipping your metadata that's been transformed out to, and which standard metadata format you've transformed it to. I think it's very flexible, and I think it's something that is going to generate a lot of value for a lot of people. All right, back to you, Eric.
With that in mind, I'll jump in just to close us out. So I know there have been a ton of great questions, and thank you so much, Dr. Schatz, for replying just in time. I think we're going to get almost 25 minutes worth of Q&A. Just to sort of recycle some of the key themes that we heard from Ashley, from Brent, and then from Matt, we can just recap here what our internal project timeline is, and helping you to understand next steps for your participation and involvement. We do have, as we mentioned within our prototype development project, we've got 2-month increments where we review the development efforts that we've done and review the working code through a demo. So we do have planned demos for DoD designated stakeholder representatives in early March, early May, early-ish July, and then a final review in September. As we mentioned previously, I mean, that's for an initial or an interim operating capability. ADL is in the process of planning, ultimately how we take that capability that we built out in the prototype and start to test it out in preparation for a full operating capability. I think there'll be opportunities in the next government fiscal year to be part of the release plan and beta testing. So there'll be certainly opportunities for some of those on this call to start to get your organizations involved. And then finally, as Brent mentioned, in the near term, there is the IEEE Learner Activity Metadata Standards Working Group. So that's an opportunity if you have a passion on the data side, or if you want to participate in the group learning that's taking place. There's an opportunity to sign up and be part of that, or at least check in to see the progress that the group is making as it relates to the standard that Brent described, that we're obviously going to be using and deploying as part of the enterprise course catalog. So with all that in mind, I'll turn it back over to Ashley to close us out, and then I think we'll probably jump straight into Q&A.
Thank you, Eric. I don't have any additional points to make, but thank you for handing it over. I know, like you mentioned, there's a lot of great Q&A going on in the chat, but I do want to give everyone the opportunity to chime in now with any other questions you might have or any points you just wanted to learn more about. We are more than happy to discuss, so feel free to ask away. Thank you.
So I see a bunch of good questions in the chat thread, and I'm going to kind of start in reverse order since I'm kind of at the bottom here. And Matt, this might be a good question to push over to you, is can you recap the pipeline? Say I get a new outside vendor and I want to put it inside the ECC. How would I use these metadata aggregation services you're building to get data from one system to the next?
Sure. So recapping the pipeline, essentially, we have our source repository, which is what you're talking about. This would be a new content provider, whether that's an internal DoD content experience provider, for example, a new training organization. I shouldn't say new, but a training organization that is new to the ECC system. And then from there, we sort of have the pipeline, unfold. So the very first thing we would need to do is we would need to look at the current set of agents and determine if there are any agents that might already be capable of interacting with this particular source repository. So can we reuse anything that's already out there? If so, then that's great. We simply package up the software that is part of the implementation of the agent that's out there and establish a new agent that's dedicated to that particular source repository. And then that can simply be hosted, whether it's local to that repository or in a different location, for example, in, say, a DoD cloud environment somewhere, as long as it can connect to the repository and extract the information, whether it's pushed or pulled or it reads a file, who knows? Everything is going to be different per agent, we assume. But basically, these agents are the things that are waking up, checking out some new content that's being shipped to them, and then it's going to transform that into this common standard. So these agents are doing a lot of work. They're waking up, looking at the new stuff, transforming it, and then they're sending it along to an index service. The index service really is a central repository for any agents configured to talk to it. So you may have index services deployed with one agent talking to them. You may have index services deployed with 300 agents talking to them. But the idea is that the agents are pulling the metadata out of repositories, transforming it to a common format, and then shipping it to an index service, potentially multiple index services. And then these index services are responsible for managing the metadata at that point. These index services are essentially sharing that information with Elasticsearch, which is a key technology that's being used in this particular solution. It doesn't have to be Elasticsearch. That's just what we've selected. Again, an index service can simply be modified in some way, open source style, to talk to a different search engine if you wanted to just deploy Solr or an Amazon, Elasticsearch, sort of thing or something. So there's all different ways to leverage the search engine. But the idea is that that's going to facilitate rapid discovery down the road. So the pipeline really is source, agent, index service, and then search engine sort of hanging off the side of the index service. Now, the other aspect of this is index services can, in the future, talk to other index services. So you can end up with these interesting configurations, constellations or stackable pyramids, or a variety of configurations where index services are working together to ultimately create repositories of discoverable learning experiences. So there's all sorts of different ways that this can fit together. So I don't know if that was too much information, but that's essentially how we see the pipeline: source, agent, index service, lots of other index services, and then discovery on top of that.
Erica, did that answer your question?
Yep. She gave us a thumbs up in the chat. Great.
Hey, Matt, this is Roger Lee from DLA. That path that you just described, is that a two-way street or is that one way?
I'm sorry, you went in and out just on the key term that you said, the can you just say that one more time?
Yeah, that path that you just described, is that a one-way street going one direction, or is it a two-way street?
Sure. So the path, you mean in terms of the pipeline of source to agent to index service?
Yeah. Is that the one directional, or can you go the other way and pull stuff in as well?
Sure. So at the moment, we haven't envisioned pushing metadata back down to a source from other places. I don't see any reason why that couldn't come along in the future as a part of this solution. You could certainly develop an agent in such a way that you could have an inbound agent and an outbound agent, for example, and one could push information to an index service, and one could take in information from an index service, and that information could flow back to another place. There's really no reason for that technically to not be the case. For the scope of this project, I know that we're focused on gathering metadata and aggregating it together to present into the interface that Ashley presented earlier.
I would add to that just to say that that's very much aligns with the way that we are using the experience index inside of the TLA reference implementation. We have other systems that are connected that might want to use that metadata. Competency management systems might want to use that as part of its calculation to determine proficiency against competency models. Recommender systems might want to be able to parse through that to look at what's the best learning path for Matt to take or for Eric to follow. So there's really just an unlimited amount of things that we can do with it as we move forward in the future.
And it's Eric. I saw there was a question around versioning and, thinking about essentially how we might deploy this. What's the sort of mechanism for deploying this? There's also that point, Matt, which you can continue to elaborate. In many ways, we're trying to make this open-ended and portable, right? This whole architecture, the flexibility of the agents, being able to plan for, various technology platforms and existing repositories, and then being able to deploy with the the oversight and the management of the metadata and what is made available, for discoverability. That sort of untethers us to a certain degree for, I think it was Jim, this focus on a version or, a specific instance of the capability. We're building the broader capability, and we would really be focused on the agents and the agent deployment themselves. There was a question too around just how often this might refresh in terms of the data and what the user would be seeing. That's also part of this, right? Handing over the controls for the implementation team or the organization to define what that data refresh is, how often we would want an agent to essentially wake up and scrape new data or update existing data. So those are definitely sort of elements of control that we're purposely planning for. And then there's one final component or element that is vital here when we talked about the schema server. And Matt, you might want to go into this. That gives us a flexibility to set our parameters for the transformation without tying that to the specific agent implementation. So there are a lot of elements in the design, for our initial development of the prototype that do allow for the flexibility so that this can be portable and implemented, across a range of organizational use cases.
Right. I think that's really the key. We've really tried to avoid creating situations with this software early on in its development that paint us into corners, right? So when there are decisions that we've run into that we've had to make, we've said, well, this really should just be a configuration option. For a great example of this is, we know that we have the P2881 standard that we're working with right now. And actually, when we started this project, it was very much in draft format. And I think Brent can comment on the nature of working with drafts, but we knew that it was draft. And so rather than creating a very rigid data structure, we understood right away that this was an area of volatility in the system with respect to change. And so we needed to protect the overall solution from being bound to a particular schema representation. And that's what caused us to go down this road of having, reference files and mapping files that we can bring into the agents and bring into the index service, rather than having hard, concrete relational data structures that force the system to only work with P2881, for example. The way that the system's being defined is that P2882 can come along at some point. And what do we need to do? Well, we need to publish some new mappings for the agents so they know how to get from source format to P2882. And the index service needs to now understand that it's accepting metadata that it should validate against. What's my configured standard? Oh, P2882 now. So, everything's very flexible and designed with the knowledge that this is an evolving, moving thing with respect to the metadata standards.
So if ECC is wildly successful beyond our imagination, how does the world look different for us in 5 years for the user?
So I'm happy to answer as much as I see for that.
I can try to keep going, Matt.
Oh, I'm happy to answer. I'd also love for the ADL to jump in maybe and talk about their long-term vision for how this fits in with the overall total learning architecture, because I think this is just one piece of a much bigger initiative at the end of the day, right? And it's all about meeting those three main challenges that Ashley highlighted earlier. That idea of, there's a huge expense right now in terms of time, in terms of difficulty finding the right learning opportunities for me at the right point in time, and then also just duplication and in terms of production of experiences and things along those lines. I would say in the short term, you're going to start seeing some discoverability becoming improved, but over the long term, I would think that it enables more just-in-time learning You run into a problem, you realize you don't have the skills to solve that problem, and it's very easy. You know where to go, you know how to find what you're looking for very quickly, and then you can access that learning quickly. I assume that there's going to be advances made in terms of the actual delivery of that. And remember, this is all about discovery with respect to this component. There's a whole initiative that's going along the lines of improving the actual experience and transformational aspect as well. But I'd see this piece really specifically focusing on just getting people to where they need to be as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think one of the big values that I see, and again, this is just my opinion, but it would be in, well, I guess two areas. First is the accessibility. And so, Matt, we've talked a lot about if I'm at Defense Acquisition University or Naval Postgraduate School, and I want to get more people that are exposed to data engineering, I don't necessarily have to go create those courses myself. I can just call up edX or Coursera or Udemy and say, hey, what kind of catalogs do you have? And then through whatever relationships are built, you can start to network those catalogs together and ship people back and forth. And that's already done to a point today, but it's done very much on a point-to-point relationship through these different proprietary APIs. I think another big part of this is now that we have, if you think of it as an inventory of all your training and education assets for an organization such as DAU or the Air University folks, and now you have a bigger pot of the inventory of assets across all DoD, you can start to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to do a whole bunch of things, from looking at that whole kind of Kirkpatrick level 4 of effectiveness and start to map the courses to the outcomes that we want to enable in the operational side of the force there. So looking at competencies kind of as the broker, you now start to be able to map the outcomes for these things over the course of time. And I think there's going to be a lot of value for that down the road, not to mention just expediting the efficiencies for learning by optimizing the learning path for each individual through these different courses based on data. Dr. Schatz often talks about data-driven decision making. And I think this is just one way to accomplish that. But as Matt said, it does play into the bigger TLA data strategy.
Thank you. That's very helpful. If I may have a follow-up question, and it was in the chat earlier, but given that the line between learning and sharing is becoming rapidly blurring, we're seeing all sorts of wiki approaches to things. So there's no sage on stage anymore. It's just conglomerate learning and with dynamic content. How are we setting ourselves up for success in terms of that future? Over.
I'll take a quick stab at that. I think that's probably a longer conversation, but in the near term, we tried to handle a lot of this in the underlying data model, that P2881. So as we get into the weeds on what different data elements are included in that standard, we have a whole range of different activity types. We've tried to open up that aperture. So you have your structured formal courses, but we know that a lot of folks might go out to YouTube to look at videos, or reading tech manuals that are stored in PDFs and some of these other types of content. So we really included the ability to define and describe all of those types of assets as well from an instructional perspective. It'll come down to the individual organizations and their business rules for what they want to make accessible and which systems they want to instrument to be able to track that. But the underpinnings are there to enable that. Any other thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, well, I could just add, on the commercial side, there are LXP services out there that you can purchase access to, such as Degreed is one, Edcast. There are lots of LXP technologies out there, and they have licensing fees, and they don't necessarily talk to your internal repositories, which is why we're exploring this open source solution, and really trying to look at some of the more specific repositories internally that exist. But if you go with one of these commercial LXPs and tap into external repositories, edX is available in Degreed and things like that. They actually have functions, or they actually have constructs for more than just courses, sort of along the lines of what Brent is saying. So, you can go to Degreed and you can do a search for artificial intelligence, and you won't just get courses from edX that pop up, for example. You'll get articles and videos and other things that they've pulled together as well. So this OpenLXP project is very much along those same lines, and it's influenced by what we've seen in the commercial sector as far as content aggregation and looking not just at courses, although that's one of the main the main consumption models right now, but looking at other types of learning as well that's going on. So articles and videos and books and really anything else, as long as it's able to be categorized and a metadata record can be constructed and then aggregated, then it could in theory be ingested and made discoverable.
And I think I'll just close that out by saying a lot of those commercial providers not just have the pull of the front end user experience, but they also have the push in terms of recommended resources on an ongoing basis. That syndication that we're really driving at through the use of these agents and through this metadata tagging. We just sort of showcased the initial core user experience feature of the portal and the discoverability, but as we move to recommended content and what was been talked about as curated content, this is again sort of part of that building towards that capability, to be more responsive and recommending resources that are right at the point of need.
Yep, I would a couple things, I guess. First, for James, I'm not sure if you were asking about the actual course data that we brought in to the prototype, or if you're talking about the P2881. Either way, we can get you that as needed, and we can follow up. And then Todd, I think you had your hands up, but I did want to mention for your specific question that you asked earlier and when you enrolled in this, I think that attention is going to be in the details. The data model that we built has a whole host of unique identifiers and sub-identifiers from an organizational perspective. And I guess what I would like to be able to do is set up time to talk to you and make sure that those are adequate for your organization. We're still very much tweaking and polishing these draft standards. So I think we can kind of get there. But let me pass it over and ask what you were going to ask. Over.
Sure. So this answers the question of how do we identify the training. The second half is the equation. How do we get that training into the personnel records? So we need some kind of a translation table or something that's going to do that. I've got 718,000 civilians in the Department of Defense that are tied to DC Pass or DCharms, which limits the course codes to 3 or 5 digits. So how do we address that problem? So
getting the performance out of the course over to the learner record, is that accurate?
Correct.
Gotcha. That's a much more detailed conversation, but we've actually got some solutions for that. And I would point you to the ADL website and the Total Learning Architecture program. Essentially, we use the Experience API to pull all the learner performance data out of the activities. We have a host of best practices for linking the activities with the competencies that those activities are teaching and rolling that performance data up into meaningful information that other connected systems can use. I feel like I could go down a really big rabbit hole right now, so I'll pause and maybe it's best if we set up a follow-on conversation about that.
That'd be great.
And I will just say we're at time, right? We got a minute left. I know there was a question around security that we could probably easily get to. And Ashley and myself are working on that, as I mentioned, as part of the project management for the prototype development. But there is, there is already a focus or an objective to meet a certain accreditation standard with regard to the information that would be handled and the controls that would be in place to handle that data, Molly. So we would need a follow-up, but that is being accounted for now, and we can speak to that in the future as well.
So for Todd and for anyone else, I'll put my email in the chat window. If you do have anything that you want to talk about, I'm happy to set up a meeting and we can meet and go deeper on some of these different vectors. I know we are running short on time.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, if the speakers are done with their time, are you all ready to say thank you to everybody and wrap it up?
This is Brent. I would just say thank you. I'll even go on camera here. I would just say thank you to Ashley, Matt, and Eric for putting together this. I feel like I got to come along for the ride and just say a few words, but these guys have been doing a lot of good work on the project. We've come a long way in a few short amount of time. For geeks, it's really interesting stuff. Thank you all.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a great day. And thanks for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.